So welcome everyone. This is an event entitled Euphoria or Margaret Mead Reimagined. My name is Keith Brown from the Watson Institute. My main job here is getting out of your way, but I first want to answer the question. People are maybe wondering, how is it that the departments of anthropology and literary arts and the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women, the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy, and the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs come to be co-sponsoring an event. And so first I have to acknowledge the generosity and collegial ethos on the part of the chairs and directors of all of those units, so thank you. I also need to thank, before I forget, Christy Kilgus, who made this all possible, who's at the back. And then I also want to just talk a little bit about the shared adherence to the principles of liberal learning at Brown University, which I think all of these department heads share, which encourage students to explore different modes of analysis and explanation, and especially since the introduction of a capstone requirement to the undergraduate curriculum, to take up the challenge best expressed by novelist Henry James, and then subsequently appropriated by an anthropologist, because that's what we anthropologists do, by Clifford Geertz. So that is to find the figure in the carpet of their undergraduate careers, to try and piece everything together under the rubric of a capstone class. And so I'm teaching a capstone seminar entitled Reading Global, which is inspired partly by arguments in favor of reading by Martha Nussbaum, as well as successive Marine Corps commandants. And in that class, we are pursuing a cross-disciplinary conversation about international relations by reading and discussing works of fiction. So hence this panel and its format. So the class read Euphoria this week, and we had the chance to talk with and hear from our guest Lily King over the past hour. I imagine most people here know the novel, that's probably why you're here. But in case not, it was inspired by the career of Margaret Mead, an anthropologist and public intellectual of the 20th century, whose work always built to pressing policy issues. So there's the Taubman connection for those of you who are worried about that. As an anthropologist, she worked in many different locations around the world. So there's the Watson Institute for International Studies, in case you were worried about that. As a woman, possibly one of the leading female public intellectuals of the 20th century, the Pembroke Center obviously has interests in her story. And as far as literary arts and anthropology goes, well, in a neat inversion of what Clifford Geertz did to Henry James, Lily King has offered us a novelist take on anthropology as practiced in and around the Second World War. So the format will be, so I ran over here. The format will be, because Lily has already been pressed by us for the last hour, we're going to give her a little bit of a break and hear from three colleagues representing different perspectives, different positions, who will reflect on their reading of Euphoria and perhaps pose a question or two to Lily King, ideally in about 6 minutes each. I'll introduce them all at once. James Morone from the Political Science Department and also head of the Taubman Center, Paja Fordray from the Department of Anthropology, and Sarah Baldwin from the Watson Institute, who is our writer in residence on the panel, our second writer in residence on the panel. So after you've heard from the three of those folks, we'll turn it over to Lily, who will answer as much or as little of what they have to say as she likes, and then we'll open it up to questions. Please, if you have questions, please use the mic in the middle and identify yourself by name. I'll try to get to everyone. We have until 5:30 in this part of the proceedings, and after that, please everyone join us for reception at the back, and Lily will be signing books as well. So thank you all for coming, and I'll invite Jim to get us going.
Thank you. This is a real pleasure for me. I love this book, and I come with enthusiasm, but not a whole lot of knowledge. I'm not an anthropologist, but I have studied some strange tribes. To me, Euphoria asks, and the reason I was so gripped by the book, it asks the deepest question for those of us in the social sciences, the deepest question of all, and that's, how do we know? How do we know people? How do we know, to use an old-fashioned term, truth? And the surface of the book is a mess if you're reading it for the knowledge of how we know things, right? These people fall in love, they fall in hate, they're driven by ambition, they distort things. You can see them messing up the enterprise of getting to know things. Summed up really nicely by Margaret Mead, one of the students put together Google Docs. If it is science, says Nels Anderson about Margaret Mead, the book is somewhat of a disappointment. It lacks a documental base. It is given too much to interpretation instead of description. Dr. Mead forgets too often that she is an anthropologist and gets her own personality involved with her materials. And here is a book about people getting personality involved with their materials big time. Now, there's a specter for those of us in the 21st century who read this, peering over us, and that's a very different way to have knowledge, to leap out of the messiness and to go with big data. It's lots and lots and lots of tiny little bits of knowledge that add up. So you ask lots and lots and lots of people, what do you think of Donald Trump? And you announce that 30% of the American public loves Donald Trump and 47% hates him, and you've got something that's replicable, something that seems scientific, and something that is certainly systematic. You ask lots and lots and lots of people, do you hate Congress? And 91% of them say yes, and you announce 9% of the American public respects Congress. And you can do this over and over again. Don't talk to a congressman, for heaven's sakes. Just look at how they vote, put it in the machine, and you can find out that one man is 100% conservative, and this woman, I'm using genders not randomly here, is 100% liberal. There are pros and cons to this specter, of course. The pro, as I just suggested, is it's so systematic, it's replicable, it's kind of scientific, and it is not messy. So, of course, grand. But it has a limited scope, right? It's shallow. It's a shallow way of knowing. When you ask someone what they think of Trump, they've just been having dinner or an argument with their partner, and they're not thinking about Trump at all, so they give you the first answer that comes to mind. And if you just look at what congressmen do and not what they say, you miss an awful lot. It's hard to get to important matters. When I was doing my dissertation, I did a systematic study of an agency that was having terrible trouble in Atlanta. And I found out that everything was fine. Everybody liked one another and they got along, and there was no way to get at the trouble. So I did interviews and spent long bits of time. I did one interview with a guy, an African-American man, and he insisted that I drink his iced tea. And we talked and talked and talked, and he just wanted to stop, and he didn't say anything. For 3 hours, we chatted, but he didn't want to let me go, and something told me to stay. And at hour 5, I didn't have, this was before the era of iPhones, so I just standing up my next interviews. He let slip something about racism, and in hour 6, he was saying that he thought the leadership was deeply racist in this agency. It took him 6 hours to get to that truth, and then later I had a long day, well, I've learned now, with the vice president of this agency, and for the first 12 hours it was great. It was all honey and milk and light, but as we had our second bottle of wine at dinner, she started dropping the N-word, just randomly, and was full of invective at people like this man I'd interviewed, and I'd stumbled on by just sitting and listening. You can't get at that with the kind of big data that we do so well. And so that throws us back on to messiness and anthropology and what Lily King has written. The depths, the shallowness of our systematic knowledge forces us back onto this very difficult way of knowing. To me, Euphoria asks 3 great questions, and I'll end with this and get in under my 6 minutes, I hope, about this difficult way of knowing. It's, of course, whom, what, and how. First, in all this messiness, the question is right front and center, and if you've studied it in class, I'm sure you talked about this a lot. Whom do we study? These 3 anthropologists go into the field, but they obviously don't do the prescribed thing. They're supposed to be scholars studying others, but before long, the others keep entering and getting enmeshed in their lives. The object becomes the subject. They write their own stories along with the stories of others. And that raises the question. It's true of these three for sure. Is it necessarily true? Is it true of most social scientists? Is it true of all social scientists? On some level, do we have to account for ourselves as we try to understand others? Question number 2, not whom, but what. What do we see? The tribes in this book are both a mirror and a window. These 3 anthropologists are trying to see, they're looking through the window, trying to see, trying to understand the tribe. And as they look, I draw on another anthropologist, really the best anthropologist of our time, and that's J.K. Rowling, who has a mirror in one of her books. If you know the books, I'm sure you know the classics. It's the Mirror of Erised. You remember, you look in the mirror, at least Harry Potter does, and he finds there nothing less than the deepest desire of his heart. And this anthropologists are looking out the window at these tribes they want to understand, and at the same time looking at the tribes, what they find, what they see, what they search is the deepest desire of their hearts. It's true of these 3 characters. Is it true of all of us social scientists? We start by understanding others, or trying, and to do so we have to know ourselves. And eventually we erase the division between them and us, between subject and object, and we have to understand an us. But to go back to the question, what do we see when we look at something we want to understand deeply? And finally, how? How do we know? And here, I think, to summarize everything I've said, we try so hard to understand ideas and thoughts and actions, things we fully apprehend with our brain. But what this book says, subversively but insistently, that it's also emotions that enter into it. It's our own desires, it's their desires. That good social science is not just about the brain, but the heart. And at least in my end of social sciences, we haven't begun to think of what it's like to understand with the heart, to study with the heart. And that's a task that this book just screams at us to get on with. And I'm delighted to hear the other speakers, and hopefully they can give us some light on that really important question. Thank you, particularly to Lily, for writing such a fabulous book.
Can you hear me okay? Okay. I want to just thank Keith, for starters, for asking me to do this, and thank Lily for writing such a provocative, wonderful, ravishing book, because I enjoyed this book a great deal, not just as an anthropologist. I suppose my comments are mostly going to be as an anthropologist, but I'm also a poet. So I'm a writer as well, and I loved the texture of the writing, so much of it. Beginning as an anthropologist, however, one of the things I loved about this book was the ability to look at our disciplinary past and view this tension between science and humanities as something that is live, important, but unresolved. And I say this as somebody who is very comfortable with the idea that anthropology is both a science and a humanistic endeavor. So I enjoyed very much this kind of glimpse of the past as coming from that particular place. And more generally, kind of like a revisiting of my ancestors in a new way. So for me, the 3 ancestors in this book were Rio Fortune, an ancestor I'd never even heard of, Gregory Bateson, a revered, at least in my corner of anthropology, linguistic anthropology, but yet somewhat neglected ancestor, and Margaret Mead, an ancestor who is certainly not forgotten, but I think is not actively relevant. And I say this as somebody who, I put in my notes to say, never read her in graduate school, but it's not often that a Brown professor does this, and I'm going to go out on a limb and admit it. I have never read Margaret Mead to this day. And I think that's not just accidental. I think she's not taught in the same way, et cetera. So revisiting her and trying to imagine what it was like in Ron Charles's review in the Washington Post, to characterize her as a woman who changed the way we look at ourselves. Therefore, I would say the discipline as a whole, to try to imagine that. This book helped me do that, and I kind of loved that about the book. And in general, I would say if anthropologists are meant to kind of make the strange, the exotic, the oddball cultures, to sort of use some of Nell's words for just a minute, to make those familiar, One of the things I loved about this book was the way it kind of did the opposite. It kind of made the familiar very strange to me. So imagine, for me, like it was kind of a trip, literally and metaphorically, to imagine floating down the Sipek River and kind of auditioning tribes, kind of like shopping for a tribe for your kind of ethnographic pleasure. It was surreal to kind of hear people talk about my tribes or my village using those kinds of possessives with zero irony or discomfort. Using the word culture as a noun instead of an adjective, as if it were kind of had a hard shell around it like an atom. Or even those domains that they used to kind of chop the world up in, so things like technology, kinship, religion, being so kind of untroubled by their boundaries, sort of convinced of their solidity, when I have been so accustomed to thinking of them as kind of like ghosts that have winds blowing through them at all times. They're kind of ephemeral, but yet not entirely gone, kind of like the vines of a strangler fig that chokes off trees but leaves behind this kind of tunnel of its former self that teems with life, but it's new life. It's new life. It's not the tree that was once there. So for me here, one of the things I loved about this book is the way these ancestors that we at some level worship, but at the same time cannibalize, kind of become revived again. And to use an image from the book that recurs a couple of times, it's kind of like this skull that the natives dig up and cover with mud and then kind of refashion into a face again. Something like that happened to the ancestral past for me reading this book, and that's one of the things that I loved about it. And therefore, for me, I was not particularly troubled by the way that this author, who in so many ways sort of cleaved very closely and yet in this kind of luminous parsimoniousness to the detail of these particular figures and their lives, I was not at all troubled by the way, towards the end, their lives take a very different tact than what we know of these actual historical figures. And indeed, for me, Margaret Mead became in some ways a much more interesting feminist, more in the terms of brown undergrads for just a minute, she became more relatable for me, given some of her tensions that were so sort of animated and so much part of this particular narrative. What does, however, trouble me, or leaves me struggling with thorny questions, is how the natives are represented in this book. So it's more that it brings me back, so in some ways the book brings me full circle. From taking me from something that was very familiar and making it strange, it brings me back again to something, at least in anthropology, that's very familiar, which is to say really thorny questions about representation, about the past of the discipline, et cetera. So I wonder, for example, how to think about the way this particular book intervenes in the complicated questions that we're continuing to ask in the discipline about representation, about how to responsibly represent others, how to responsibly represent past. So the author was very careful not to exoticize the people of the Sipek River, not to orientalize them, and at the same time to sort of cleave to the orientalizing, exoticizing tendencies of that particular era. And nevertheless, I found myself wondering, despite those different layers of distance, the distance that this happened many years ago, that these were private thoughts versus being publicly circulatable treatises or articles, that this is fiction, after all, not anthropology, and that the author is not in any ways presenting herself as an anthropologist. I still found myself troubled by the kind of unevenness of representation here, how we know at the end of the day so much more about the anthropologist than we do about the context surrounding them. Again, not so much because all books should do that, but just because I wonder how it intervenes in these ongoing questions about how we represent others, how we represent otherness. Or to sort of mobilize a quote from the book for just a minute, when Bankson says, when only one person is the expert on a particular people, do we learn more about the people or the anthropologist when we read the analysis? A quote that I loved in part because it reminded me of something I once heard somebody say about Napoleon Chagnon, who kind of succeeded Margaret Mead in the kind of popular ethnography canon. He wrote a famous book called Yanomami, the Fierce People, and a professor of mine from grad school represented him as, it's really not Yanomami, the Fierce People, it's Napoleon Chagnon, the fierce anthropologist, who would get into fistfights with nearly everybody over various things. raises for me questions about how this book kind of positions itself, or how this book intervenes, how this book participates in those thorny questions about representation, et cetera. Which links me to two questions which I'll kind of lead with. One is sort of more factual or procedural or processual, I suppose, is did you consult native sources? Were there any native sources? What would the book have looked like if you had consulted native sources, if they exist? If they didn't, how would that have made your book different? But also, what would it look like to tell, and I don't mean you personally, but I kind of mean, in some sense more broadly, to tell a very different story indeed. So in some of the reviews of the book, it was sort of positioned as a very different story of Margaret Mead reimagined indeed. But what would it look like to have a story of Margaret Mead not as a battered wife, but as not even as overlord, the way she's been positioned by some people, but as kind of exotic wallpaper, as kind of ethnic other? What would it look like to have that kind of book? How would we make that kind of book possible? What would we gain by having that kind of story of Margaret Mead's life? And I'll leave there saying again, thank you to the author for a wonderful book.
Strangler fig, nice metaphor. Mirror and window, nice metaphor, Jim. It's nice to be on a panel with writers. You too, Keith, the carpet. I know, but you used it. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Lily, for this wonderful book, and thank you for letting me reflect about it out loud. I'm glad I left the political and anthropological considerations to the scholars today. My response to the novel will be as to a literary artifact. So my questions and comments have nothing to do with social science and everything to do with the process and the craft of writing. I wanted to look at this intricately constructed book in all its parts to figure out how Lily King did it, how she made this story work. And we don't have enough time to do that here, but I will just touch on some things that I found really astonishingly well done. I should say that when Keith very excitedly told me about this book, Euphoria, my enthusiasm was polite, to say, if not tepid. A novel based on Margaret Mead. Oh, that's great. And there's a love triangle. Not exactly the type of book that I was used to reading, but I was quickly seduced. Right away, there was evidence of what I believe are this writer's greatest strengths: acute observation of people and their environment rendered in exquisite language. Already on page 1, King's ability to translate a recurring fever into the gap between sensation and recognition of it. Euphoria is full of these uncanny, brilliantly observed details: the uncomfortable intimacy of the sound of someone snoring, the feeling of a pregnant woman's belly echoing in one's hand, learning the flavor of a culture sip by sip. I am also in awe of King's natural fluid dialogue, which I cannot do, as my mentor and your friend know. We actually hear each character, and it's through dialogue that the characters reveal themselves. It's virtually the only way we get to know Fenn. So we have these 3 nationalities, 3 personalities, and we have 3 completely distinct voices. It's a tour de force. And there's the use of letters and journal entries, which is quite ingenious and never feels contrived, which it might have. Bankson's letters to his mother serve to advance the plot by relating events that have occurred, while Nell's journal entries not only drive the plot forward miles from Bankson, who is our primary narrator, they also enable us to grasp the dramatic irony of Bankson's narrative, which is that he doesn't know that he's had the same effect on Nell that Nell has had on him. The letters that Nell receives give us these handholds, these little clues, these reminders to where we are in time. There's the Lindbergh baby kidnapping. There's a mention that we're 6 years away from what would become World War II. I'm an essayist, not a novelist. I am most comfortable thinking on the page. peeling away layers of an idea, making sense of things that have actually happened. I can't make things up. I love to read fiction, and I've mostly had the good sense not to try to make fiction. But recently, I forced myself to do this, and my attempt to write fiction has revealed one big thing to me, and that is that you have to love your characters with all their flaws. And Lily King loves her characters. She loves them, warts and all. And that, I believe, is why they are so real and so alive and so complex and so present. She breathes life-giving love into them. Even Fen, whom I did not find remotely likable, on the contrary, but I found him real. And I think that love comes from a deep, compassionate understanding of humans, which may or may not be related to anthropology. It's like Jim's window and mirror. I think an author can't write about people with such complexity and compassion without really understanding them herself. And that's why Euphoria made me, without understanding people in general, and that's why Euphoria made me, as a would-be fiction writer, feel stingy and misanthropic. I can barely tolerate my characters. But as a fiction reader, because of King's love for her characters, I felt so connected and so implicated that when I read those final lines, each time, because I've read the book more than once, I cried out. I had a visceral reaction, and then I cried. Finally, I was intrigued by this unexpected, but I think very credible, layering or melding of the intellectual and the erotic. I don't think I've ever seen scholarly discovery and intellectual communion rendered as a ménage à trois. And what better way could there be to express the connection among these three characters? What better way to convey the intensity of their excitement about ideas? Because that's what turns you guys on, right? I could say more, but I'll just end with a few questions for Lily. As writers, sometimes we doubt our project. We think it's dumb or a dead end or doomed never to be read, and I wonder, did that ever happen to you? And second, tell me what you did to know your characters so well. Did you write their biographies? Did you write them letters? And finally, when and how did you know that Nell was going to die? Thank you.
Sorry, I'm taking notes here.
Keith, say something.
What should I say?
I'm coming. Okay. All right, I have a lot of things to bring with me.
Got the wall chart?
What's that? I have no idea what I'm going to say, but I have a lot of props. Thank you so much. Thank you, Keith, for initially coming to my reading in southern Massachusetts somewhere. It was at Cohasset or some random place where we met, and then inviting me here. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for all of your remarks. They're so intriguing to me. I really wish that I didn't have to speak and I could just, hear more. I love the questions, and I love. I just love seeing what people, hear in the novel, because you really don't know what you're doing. You're trying to say certain things, and you don't know if you're saying them correctly, and you want to fit so much in, but the novel can only hold a certain amount of things, and you don't ever want to feel like you're making a speech of any kind, or sort of promoting an ideology, or campaigning in some way. You really want it to be an organic experience for the reader, and when you're writing it over and over, you're writing draft after draft, and you're just trying to figure out what will feel organic to the reader when it's such an inorganic process for you, because you're doing it again and again and again, and it's not just blooming out of you in one fell swoop, and then you're sending it off to the publisher. So I thought I would talk a little bit about how I came to write the book and try to answer some of those great questions. I really wasn't looking for an idea at all when I came upon Margaret Mead. I was at the very, very beginning of writing my third novel, Father of the Rain, which is about a father-daughter lifelong sort of relationship. It spans 34 years, and it's a very, very disturbing relationship and completely not a historical novel. I've never written a historical novel before this one, or historical. I mean, it's sort of a hybrid, I would say. And I don't read them. And so I was happily writing my completely invented novel. And a friend of mine came by my house and said, I'm going to take you to my favorite bookstore. And I live in Yarmouth, Maine, and she took me to Portland, Maine, and we got there, and the bookstore was going out of business. This was in 2005. And there were closeout sales all over the place, and signs, and there was hardly anything in the bookstore. And I felt like I had to buy something because she had brought me there. And so I picked up this copy of Margaret Mead, A Life. I found it in the corner. And I thought, okay, well, I'll just buy this, and then I'll just shove it under my bed, and nobody has to see it again. And I actually got home, and I started reading it, and it wasn't one of those biographies there that, starts with the grandparents and then goes to the parents, and then on like page 250, you get to the subject. It really starts off, and it was very compelling to me, and I didn't expect it at all. And I got to this chapter called The Closest I've Ever Come to Madness, and I think it's chapter 11, and it's only about 12 pages. And I read that chapter. She's with her second husband, and it's Christmas time. They're thinking about leaving and going to Australia. They're trying to avoid this other anthropologist, Gregory Bateson, very, very much like my novel starts out. And Margaret Mead and Gregory Bateson meet, and in her memoir she says that they talked for 36 hours and she fell madly in love with him. And so he urges them to stay, and he visits them a lot, and they send notes back and forth. I couldn't work this into my novel, and I wanted to so badly, because apparently the canoe boy who was bringing the notes back and forth from Mead to Bateson, who had built a house very close by to where they were, he said he was delivering those notes morning, noon, and night, every single day for 5 months, and I couldn't quite ever work that in. And they were doing these little poem games things, and bourrimé. I don't know if anybody has ever heard of them, but they're sort of like, it's like a combination of a puzzle and a poem that you're writing together. And anyway, I was hooked. I mean, just on that alone. And then her second husband gets very jealous, and but also they have this sort of intellectual breakthrough with what they call the squares, and it kind of, they're suffering from malarial fevers, and the whole thing was just so interesting to me, just because I am a writer who loves the pressure cooker situation. I love claustrophobia. And usually I get the claustrophobia from families, because I've had a lot of families. I find them extremely claustrophobic. And it's all set in a house, and you have certain rules, and kids have to conform to these wacky things that the parents have set up. And so that's always been sort of my place where I have felt comfortable to write about that kind of emotional and relational claustrophobia. But this was another thing, and I remember stopping in the middle of that chapter and thinking, oh God, someone's going to write this novel, And my very second thought was, that is not going to be me. I do not write about any of, this is way, way, way out of my comfort zone. I write about people with, who live in houses, who have running water and indoor toilets, and that sort of thing. And so, I thought that I would just put it aside, but I had to know more. I had to know more about that particular time. And so Father of the Rain turned out to be a very difficult novel for me to write consistently. It would kind of come out of me in a way that fiction doesn't normally come out of me so quickly, but then it would just dry up, and I would stop. And my kids were quite young at the time. I think they were maybe 4 and 6. And I would have to just stop because I could tell it was taking me down. It was very much fiction, but I was really drawing on a lot of stuff from my childhood. And when I stopped and I had to take these long breaks, I would go and I would read another book about Margaret Mead, or I'd read another book by Margaret Mead. And I started taking notes, and I really just kind of started sneaking around with her. And this is the notebook that I kept all my notes in. And it's funny because I have a few things in the I usually leave my first page of anything, of any notebook blank. So I have these things that I knew I was interested right from the beginning. And one of them it's a quote. It says, "Her definition of an ideal culture was one that found a place for every human gift." And I was just interested in her desire. It says right here at the very beginning of my little initial notes, I'm trying to figure out what is this going to be about? And one of the first things I wrote was boundaries. She went to Samoa to escape the rigidity of our culture, to break boundaries, to free herself, interest in change and freedom, intoxicated by freedom, by other choices, other normalcies. And so that's kind of what took me in there was Margaret Mead's curiosity and quest to figure out how to live and how we can live better, because she was really an anthropologist who was interested in social change. She wanted to go there and however problematic this is, and certainly from our perspective it certainly is, she wanted to go in there and learn and sort of take the news back to the Western world, to America, and say, look, this is how people are doing it here. All these taboos that we don't even think of as taboos are just, on the spectrum of human behavior. And I was just sort of intrigued by that notion and by her curiosity, and then I started learning about anthropology, and it sort of opened up a Pandora's box of themes for the novel that I really felt like I had to control, because immediately when you have an American, an Australian, and an Englishman going into the situation and behaving like colonists, even though they feel like some of the most enlightened people the West has ever produced. From our perspective, they certainly were not. And they were certainly behaving in various ways and to various degrees like colonists. And their sort of notion of Western possession and greed, even though they could criticize the mines for coming in and taking some of the men from the indigenous populations and taking them off to the mines and having them work. They also had an extreme greed themselves, and the notion of freedom, sexual freedom, all sorts of freedoms play out in the novel and in their sort of quest for knowledge. And so when I started this book, I had a very similar idea of Margaret Mead. My concept of her was very much like somebody named Joan Frank wrote in the San Francisco Chronicle when she wrote about this book 2 summers ago. She said that her image of Margaret Mead was a doughy, dotty brain box, kin in warbles and waddles to Julia Child and Eleanor Roosevelt. And I think that was, pretty much my idea of her as well. And so I think that attributed to some of my curiosity and interest in her and seeing her in a different way. And my idea really was that I was going to do all of this research, and I would get all through my research, you can see in my notebook there's stars everywhere, and I put stars every time I kind of got a good idea or a good detail for something. Then I would see a scene, I would hear dialogue, and I would write that down as well. And that's sort of how I put that together. My idea was that I was going to stick to the facts, but I was going to anytime I had to flesh things out, that it would be a novelist sort of interpretation of the facts as they were. And she was going to be called Margaret. He was going to be called Gregory Bateson, and he was going to, her husband was going to be called Ray O'Fortune, and that's the way it was going to be. And I started out like that for about 8 pages. And then I very quickly realized that there was the train of facts, and there was the train of the novel. And I really thought that we were on parallel tracks, and that I could just write this train of the novel, that I could just kind of fill in what wasn't filled in, because there really isn't a lot of information out there about this 5-month period. But those two trains immediately went like that. And I had to make the decision, you know, who am I? Why am I doing this? And I had to jump on the fiction train, because that was really all I knew. And I had to kind of give up any loyalty to her biography. And so immediately, I didn't know how far we would go apart, but I knew that it wasn't working like that for me, that I needed complete freedom to do whatever I wanted to do. And so I changed all their names, and I made up the names of the tribes, and I researched a lot of different places and tribes, and I just kind of used what I didn't want to be beholden to particular tribes and trying to get them right, because I had never even taken an anthropology class. So I needed to just make it up. And so the whole exercise was really an exercise in giving myself permission to just make it all up. And then I started chapter 2 with this idea that was just an exercise, and it's from the point of view of my character, Andrew Bankson, in sort of a crisis before he meets them, and he tries to commit suicide. And I just wanted to get into his head before we met them. And once I got into his head, everything changed. I realized, oh my God, this isn't even her story. This is his story. He's telling this story. He's telling it from, I realized as I went on in the book that he's telling it from in the future, and the future kept on getting older as a narrator as I went on, and so I had to sort of accept that this was his story for whatever reason. And to get to your question about how did I get to know them, one thing I did really, really early on, because I was frustrated, I felt really, I felt like Margaret Mead was too dominant. I needed to have my character, Nell Stone, and I needed to have them be mine in a way. Oh, it sounds so colonialistic. But I started a file on my computer of biographies, of autobiographies, actually. And so for each one, I started, I was born in blah, blah, blah. And I would just kind of go. And so I probably had 15 to 20 single space typed pages of their lives. So that even before I really moved on very far in the book, and I needed to do that because I didn't know them, and I needed to hear each of their individual voices for sort of a sustained period. And so a lot of chapter 4, which is Bankson's backstory, living in England, my editor and my agent tried to get me to just get rid of that chapter, and I just would not get rid of it. And of course, it's the one thing that the New York Times called out as like maybe being a flaw. Not the one thing, one of the things, I should say. And so I continued there I went back and I sort of carried on, and he definitely became the narrator of the story. And I'm trying to think. I know I've gone way over my time. So the other questions I was going to answer. The big question about how to responsibly represent the indigenous populations and the people of the tribes that they were studying. And did I read any? I mean, of course, this was a huge, huge ethical dilemma for me, as you can imagine. And I felt so limited by my perspective. You know, I had a first-person narrator, and yes, he had access to Nell's journals, and so we were able to get into her mind. And I actually did have one draft where I was in Zamboon's head, and he was doing some narrating of the story. But it didn't work within the structure of the novel, and I felt like Bankson was telling this story, and there was no way to kind of get around that, and I felt like the best I could do was try as hard as I could to get Nell in her journals and in any description of those scenes to write it as with as much understanding and feeling as I could, knowing that not only were my Western characters limited, but I am limited. I mean, I have not lived among those people, and all I could do was use my imagination to try and just see them. But of course, the whole time I was seeing them, I was writing through my characters' perspectives. And I think your suggestion of a novel where Margaret Mead is the exotic wallpaper is so fascinating and would be a phenomenally interesting novel. And I do hope that someone writes that. Perhaps you.
It won't be me, but I hope somebody from the Sepik River will write that novel.
Yeah, I mean, that would be amazing. And I didn't have a lot of sources. I didn't find a lot of sources, native sources. The one book that I cite that I adored was called Kiki, and that was from somebody from Papua New Guinea of that time who was befriended by an I want to say sort of anthropologist / missionary. That man encouraged Kiki to write tales of the stories that he was told when he was growing up. And so I read all of those with much interest. And that, I think, was maybe the only one I ever found. And in terms of doubt, your question about doubting, I honestly doubted the entire time I was writing this. The students and I were talking about this earlier. I really, I felt like I was very, very far away from anything that I knew fictionally or that I knew how to do. And I was very worried that what I was trying to do would be misinterpreted, or that I wasn't going to be able to write it well enough to convey what I was trying to do in this novel. And there were so many doubts, so many times. I remember one of the very first questions I got when I had my first reading was, when you were writing this book, did you have moments of euphoria? And my editor and my agent were like in the front row, and I said no. And they were like, we have to work on that answer. But I really, it was rough going. I never felt comfortable with it, and I don't really know what to do with that now, because I'm writing something else and I don't feel comfortable with it, and I don't know whether to quit or to keep going, because I have no, I don't have an ability to discern now. So. I think that's maybe all. Should I turn it over to questions? Okay. Thank you. Okay, sure.
So if anyone has questions, maybe use the mic in the middle, if that works. So if you can make your way to the mic, then stand in line and...
Hi.
Hi.
I have a question. I was very fascinated during your talk about the reaction of your editors is saying, take this out, and you didn't want to take it out. And I'm very curious about what is, I was very struck by the power in your mind of what you were convinced, you had conviction about what you wanted to say and what you didn't want to say. So I was wondering, what do you say is the impact on you of input? When does input matter? When does it not? When do you care what somebody says to you, and when do you say, forget about it, and I'm going in my own inner voice? And I wonder if you talk about that.
Yeah, it's a really great question. The way I write is I write many, many drafts, and I don't show it to anybody. And in between writing the drafts, I set it aside for several weeks, and I bring it back, and I go through it again. And I try to pretend that I am an editor reading someone else's work as best I can. And I do that, and I do that until I don't have any more advice for myself. And then I give it to my husband, I give it to my writers group, and then eventually I give it to my agent and my editor. And I never know what really matters to me until I get their feedback. Then, if I dig in, then I know, okay, this is something that matters. And then other things that I think would have mattered, and there's suggestions, well, that's not, and then I'm like, well, let's get rid of it, let's change it, and I feel like at that moment, after I've done it so many times, I feel like I'm really, really ready for input. And I try to be as open-minded as I can, and I trust my editor so much. We've worked on all 4 of my books together, and we speak a language, and I feel like she really understands my work, and I know that I've learned that I have to trust her oftentimes when I don't at first, and I will sometimes, insist on something, and then at the very end, she really always wins. We always have some little battle.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I absolutely loved your book.
Oh, thank you so much.
In 1992, I traveled along the Sepik River in
Wow.
Papua New Guinea. And so I have 2 questions. One is, did you ever consider during your writing process going there? And the second thing is, did anybody there ever read your book? Because there are people there who read.
Right.
I mean, did you ever
there are
send your
lots of
book
people.
to Papua New Guinea and have people read the drafts or anything, or the finished product?
I don't know of anybody in Papua New Guinea who's read the book. And I definitely should have gone there in hindsight, I have to say. No, I obviously wish I had. The doubt and the sense that this was not a book that was going to see the light of day was one reason I think that I couldn't quite admit that I was doing this. It just seemed a little too far-fetched for me. And also, I have trouble just going down to Boston for a night and leaving my family. So going there without them, because I would have had to go without them, was something that I really couldn't even consider at that moment. My kids are older now, they're 14 and 16. I could probably do that with more comfort, but then I could not. And also it was a question of cost. I couldn't be guaranteed that I was ever going to sell this book. So
Now that it's been so successful, your children are old.
I would really, really love to. Thank you. I'd love to talk to you afterwards and hear about it. Hi.
I'm wondering whether, in the course of your research, you interviewed any of the Meade Bateson family members, and if you did or didn't, whether you've had any feedback at all from them. I don't know how many people know, but Margaret Meade's granddaughter and namesake was a graduate student here in the anthropology department.
She was here. I did not know
She was
that.
here at Brown, and that meant that Margaret came quite a bit. She was one of the
Wow.
people who helped dedicate the Grad Center in 1968. And she
so
would come to visit her
interesting.
granddaughter frequently, and she was very close to Bill Beeman and Carl Heider, who taught in the department.
Wow.
But I'm wondering whether you talked to Catherine Bateson or...
So, before I wrote while I was writing the book, I did not. I just relied on some sources. I mean, there was a part of me that wanted to know a lot, and then there was a part of me that wanted to have room for my imagination. And so I learned certain things, but I didn't want to know everything. And I felt that that I never really thought about talking to their family. But about a month, when I got this hardcover, and before it came out, I wrote a long letter to Mary Catherine Bateson, and I sent her the book. And then she wrote me back very, very kindly and graciously and said kind things about the book. And we had a nice back and forth. And then a week and a half ago, I went to New Hampshire for a reading, and they invited her, and she came 2.5 hours across New Hampshire to this reading in Conway, and we had dinner together beforehand, and it was just such a pleasure and an honor to meet her. And she sat right in the front row for my talk, and I was telling Keith, I mean, the audience asked me some tough questions, with her right there, and it was hard, but she was really, really wonderful. I mean, one of the questions was about the abuse that her mother suffered from Rayo Fortune, her second husband, and I listed all of the things that I had read, and then I turned to Mary Catherine and I said, "Is that your understanding?" And she said, "Yes, it is." But I felt so uncomfortable being sort of somewhat of a, pretending to be an authority on her mother and what an extremely personal part of her life in front of her. It was a little awkward, but she was wonderful. Thank you. Hi.
My question comes from the positionality of being an anthropologist, and I have to say I just could not put your book down. I really, really loved reading it, and part of it is, as Paja was saying, just seeing the care with which you were treating our ancestors, right? Giving this life to these people. But another part of it was how you just kept getting stuff right about what it's like to be an anthropologist. And so just what it's like to do the research, to figure stuff out. And I wondered, it seemed like you got that from more than just reading stuff by and about Mead. I was curious whether you had done other reading wider in anthropology, not having studied it, but had you explored it a little bit more broadly, or is all of that from the way that she and other people writing about her understood this discipline?
Thank you. Thank you so much. I am so glad to hear that. I mean, I can hardly really believe it's true, because I do feel like I didn't know I certainly knew nothing about anthropology going in, and then I read what I could, but I couldn't obviously read enough. I mean, it never felt like enough. And I would get these huge anthropology textbooks, and I would think I should go up to Bowdoin and take a class, and I'd look at these textbooks, and they're basically Greek to me. They have all these charts, and they have all these, kinship things, and I was like, I just had to write a novel. I don't know if I can read this textbook. And I feel like I read, her books carefully, and I tried to imagine how she got the information she did, and I feel like I mostly made things up. I mean, I don't know if she had people into her house. I actually think she didn't. I don't know. I just sort of made up a lot of details, but I do think that there are huge similarities between being an anthropologist and being a writer. I think that we are very invested observers, and so I was actually, when I was driving down here, I was listening to it on tape because I feel so disconnected from the book. I wrote it so long ago, and so to talk about it, so I just was like, I'm coming to Brown. I better know what this book is about. And so I started listening to it, and I was really struck by something that people have been telling me that I kind of didn't really realize, is how much when they talk about their work, it sounds like two writers talking about their work, and all of both the competition and that desire to get it right, and when they're doing the grid, and when they're reading Helen's manuscript in the book, and they're getting so excited by what she has done, and it makes them feel like they can do this, and the book feels like it's urging them on to write their own stuff about what they're studying. And that's so much like reading a great novel, and just having sort of a world open up and being inspired in that way. And so I feel like I really drew on my experiences being a writer mostly. And then certainly I tried to read ethnographies. I really tried to find, I wanted to find anthropologists publishing their journals, and I also tried to stick to that time period, although I did have to branch out every now and then. But I never found enough of that, I felt. So I was very, very nervous going into it. So thank you.
I am just wondering if this is being considered for film, and what questions that would raise for you about representation being on the other side of it, whether that is a prospect that excites you or whether it's something that gives you nightmares. I found myself reading, kind of picturing various film versions in my mind, and also getting very anxious about how abusive a badly done film could be.
Yeah.
And I think that just raises a whole other set of questions, and so I'm just wondering, where you are with that.
Thank you. Yes, it's really true. I haven't had that anxiety yet, but I'll add it to the list now. So I did sell the film rights to a director named Michael Apted and his wife, who's also a producer, Paige Simpson. And they had a screenwriter named David McGee write the screenplay, and I think it's excellent. I love it. I liked it more than the book, actually. He does some really interesting things, and I feel like any dialogue that he put in, I really, really liked. I wrote him back and I said, more of you and less of me, because he used a lot of my dialogue, and I'm like, no, because it's just more filmic. I mean, I really liked it, but right now they're trying to find financing, and they're trying to find actors, and it seems like it's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing. You need the actors to get the financing. You need the financing to lure the actors, and so who knows if it will ever happen. They seem very gung ho. It's never been. I mean, I shouldn't say this because certainly we could use it financially with 2 kids going to college, but it's never been a huge dream of mine. The dream for me is the book, and I can only think of ways in which the film would go wrong, and I think you're so right about that. I mean, I hope to be very involved if it ever happens. Mary Catherine Bateson, I think, is worried about that too. So she'll be right in there, I'm sure. So.
I can't resist. I know I've talked a lot, but I want to ask a couple of questions that were raised as you were talking. And I really appreciate this sort of separate tracks going further and further apart. And I'm just picturing your struggle to keep it true, but no, ultimately being a novelist. So let me ask the corniest question. I'm not going to admit crying at the end of the book. Absolutely not in public. But when did Nell die? Was it in the very first draft? Was it sort of somewhere along the line? When did you know she was going to die? So I'd just love to hear that, that simplest, most naive of all questions.
Yeah, no.
What happened to this character we fell in love with?
So I thought that she had died in the first draft, but I went back and read it, and indeed she hadn't. It was a horrible, horrible ending. I'm not even going to tell you how bad it was, because I can't tell you. It's just unspeakably bad.
Wow. Tell us. No, go ahead.
I think very, very initially. Okay. All right. Excuse me. She did die. She did die in the first draft, but she died differently. And it was poorly done, and it was a rush job, as all of my first draft endings are, just a huge rush job. And Bankson heard the news on the boat. And he had heard, okay, I'll tell you, but you just can't tell anybody, okay?
Promise.
Fire. There was a fire on the boat, and he heard that the ship ahead of him had burned. And I think ultimately we were to assume that Fenn was responsible. So it was just bad. And then in subsequent drafts, other things happened, and I always knew, I was telling the students today, that but initially when I thought that it was going to be Margaret Mead, after it was Margaret Mead and it was Nell, but Nell was telling the story, and it was still her story, then that it was going to be Bankson who died, and it was going to be her loss. I knew that not all three of them were going to make it out. I had that realization early on, which is very strange for me because I never, ever kill off my characters, and so that was new, but I felt that it just felt right to me, and I think with endings, as I was saying in class, sorry to repeat myself, that you really want there to be the ending to be a surprise, but you also want it to be completely inevitable, and so. I think the surprise for this one, I just think people never thought that because it was loosely based on Margaret Mead that she was going to die. So I think that increases the surprise factor. But I did feel, when I started writing it, and honestly, there's a lot of information, not a lot, but there are a few clues along the way when I did the research that Margaret Mead was abused by Rayo Fortune. And as I started writing that, it did become inevitable that that's where it was going, and I can't really explain that because in real life it obviously wasn't inevitable. But when I wasn't looking for some sort of flashy, plot. I don't do plot really very well, and so it did surprise me. But I felt like it was where it was going, and also the tone when Bankson was telling the story, even from the beginning, it had this sadness that even came before I even knew why he was so sad. He told it with sadness, and that had to play out in some way. So thank you for that question. Not corny at all.
So if no one else is going to ask the question. So I have a question about World War II.
Yeah.
And how, because, so the excuse I had for signing this book to the class was that it had something to say to international relations. And you do have this, you imagine this different world in which, so research is published and then it's appropriated by Nazi Germany, and the characters, or Bankson at least, reflects on this. So was that, where were you on the two tracks there? Because this is...
Straddling them.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Yes, I read that they did have the squares, and they were very similar to the way they are in the book, and that they never did anything with it. And Margaret Mead said in her memoir and subsequent other places that that they were worried that because of the culture and what was the spirit of the times, or the sort of biological determinism that was really taking hold, not just in Germany but in the United States, that she worried that it was going to be appropriated, that it would get in the wrong hands. I half believe that. But what I really believe is that the three of them had this experience and this breakthrough, and they were a little out of their minds, as she said. And when you look at the grid, it's not really a great intellectual breakthrough, I don't think. You guys could, the anthropologists in the room could definitely speak to that more than I can. But it seemed to me that it was more a result of everything that was happening with them interpersonally, and a way for them to kind of reconnect and not have everything explode in their faces. And I think probably when they got away from it, they were sort of like, well, and also the three of them could never have worked together on it. Their relationship, she left Rayo Fortune and she married Bateson, and I don't think there was any way, exactly who would claim ownership of it, and how would they work together. And so Mead always gave that reason, the Nazi reason. And so I ran with that. I was interested in that. I'm not sure, as I said, I don't 100% believe that's the whole truth, but I was interested in what that would look like, and so I played that out for him. And I again, I mean, there's another part, obviously, during World War II when he works for the OSS and they take information, and it ends up that the information that he gives them results in a whole village being killed, and so there's this several times in the novel, where people appropriate information, and it just has such a negative, horrible outcomes, and so I was interested in that. That play of, the possession of knowledge and who gets it and what they do with it.
Can I presume to ask one more question?
Of course.
I'm a social scientist like Jim. We're both political scientists. And so I'm very fascinated by the comment you made. Curious about what your view is, your obligation, if you feel any at all, and I'm not saying you should, 2 questions of fact and historical accuracy. I was very fascinated with your description. So you're inspired by the situation. At some point you realize that now you've understood the situation, and now you feel free to write the novel without having to be literally accurate to the situation. On the other hand, when you described meeting Mary Catherine Bateson, you sounded worried about, did you have the facts right? Did you interpret it correctly? So you feel a tension, and I wonder if you could talk about that, because people, the social, we're sort of stuck with facts.
Yeah.
And yet we're too postmodern to really believe how concrete those facts really are.
Yeah.
I'm in the middle of writing a family memoir, and as I try to imagine my relatives in different situations, and I'm trying to give an account factually of what they did, I'm constantly struck by the difficulty of ever really being sure I understand why they did what they did. So I'm on loose ends here in relationship to my own story and my own profession, but you're a writer, and we get lots of controversy. There's the movie that was made on Selma, produced a huge controversy in our field because many people were very critical of the maker of that movie for a distortion of Johnson's role in the whole thing. So there's lots of controversy there. So I'm just curious, you're an author, and I completely accept the validity of what you do. I don't feel that you're obligated to be accurate to the facts, but I'm curious about your view of what you feel a tension in your head, and I'd like you to talk about that if you would.
It's an excellent, excellent question. I feel like we could talk about it for a very long time. I have to side with Faulkner, who said facts have nothing to do with the truth. And I mean, it couldn't be more true. I can give an example in the book I was talking about, Father of the Rain, the very first chapter. There are a lot of things that you can find in that first chapter that align with my life. The location, the town in Massachusetts, the house, the swimming pool, the very liberal mother and the very conservative father, and the inner city kids coming to swim in the swimming pool while the father's in the house making fun of them. There are all these situations that are very much something that I experienced as a child. And I have at the end the father, the kids, it's nighttime, they've had a barbecue, the father's jealous of the mother who has a good friendship with the man who has brought the kids to swim in the pool. And the kids are swimming in the pool, and the father decides with the daughter that they should, as a joke, take off all their clothes and streak, it's the 70s, and streak around the swimming pool and to really horrify and embarrass the mother. So that never happened. So I've set up a situation where everything kind of aligns with how you would think my life went, but that scene never happened. It is the very truest thing I can tell you about my childhood. It was that moment that never happened. And I can't, there's a certain, consolidation and concision that happens in fiction that is outside of real life. And I mean, memoirists, certainly really good memoirists, can really get it right with all the facts lined up. But then, I mean, you also, I mean, certainly when you're talking about memory, what are the facts? I mean, we all are imagining everything. I mean, we'll have 100 different versions of what was said here today, you know, that sort of thing. But it was a particular struggle because I was not dealing with my life. I was dealing with other people's lives, and what was my responsibility there? You know, I knew legally that if people have died, you can write anything. You know, that you can't libel the dead, basically. So I knew kind of legally I was okay, but I definitely, as I said before, really had to align myself with the story. I was really interested in telling a story, and I was much less interested in telling what happened with Margaret Mead, and that is where my loyalty lies always as a writer. And we live in a time, particularly right now, with all of this, you know, with all of our screens and our Google and our Wikipedia and our reality television, you know, where we are really attached to facts and the truth. And I feel like sometimes I'm speaking another language, and my valuing of the imagination over these facts sometimes it just doesn't resonate with people. And I have had readings where people get very angry that I killed off, you know, a great feminist of the 20th century. You know, I cut her at the knees. I killed her at age 31. You know, and I get that, but at the same time, oh, sorry, I've talked so much. You're going to sit down. Sorry. So that's my long answer to that. Sure. Did you want to ask something? No. Okay.
Well, on that theme of why, if someone could come to the book and not know it's based on Margaret Mead, so why make that a part of these questions? You know, couldn't it just be a story about anthropologists, an ethnography of anthropologists in that time period? You know, sort of thing. So, I mean, why is the Margaret Mead thing, you know, carried over in how you're talking about it and how it's marketed and how all of that?
Yeah, well, it's a really, really good question. I mean, I took a lot, you know. I didn't just take, oh, you know, they had a relationship, you know, I did take a lot of information, and I felt like I couldn't just behave like I made it up, that I had to, in the back, you know, there's 3 pages of, you know, explaining why, you know, kind of how I did this and what sources I used. I really felt like I needed to do that. And my editor really wanted to hold back on the whole Margaret Mead thing. I mean, she really didn't want it to be front and center. Of course, the marketing people did. And my publisher was very aware of the power, you know, in our culture right now of using historical figures. And so he went around, you know, he'd give like a one-sentence blurb to booksellers, you know, wherever he would go. This is Morgan Entrekin, who owns Grove Atlantic, and he's very, very charismatic and very social. And so, you know, he'll just grab you and tell you about a book, like, you know, in 15 seconds. And so I think he said, Margaret Mead went into the jungle with 1 husband and came out with 2. And so, you know, that immediately, I mean, that happened in 9 months before the book came out. That's what he was telling everybody. And so it became the Margaret Mead book, you know, before I could even control the message. That's sort of, you know, how it happened.
It's interesting that I actually studied anthropology 20 years ago, and I'm not an anthropologist now, but even at that time, you know, Margaret Mead was, as you said, you know, kind of being relegated to not relevant anymore, but an historical figure, but not relevant to anyone's study today is sort of like, well, that's how we did it, you know, back then, and don't do that anymore. And But because I study anthropology, of course, I knew Margaret Mead, but I'm wondering if people didn't understand, like, so their marketing is Margaret Mead, thinking that people do know who that actually is, and that's enough of a hook. So I guess your answer is yes.
And I think
it's still somehow in our popular culture if you're not an anthropologist.
so. When you publish a book and you go out on the road, you quickly learn that your readership is pretty much 80% women over 65. It turned out, love you. You are my, my people. You're my readers. And it turns out that half of those people saw Margaret Mead speak somewhere. I mean, honestly, and I don't think the marketing people who are like, 30 or 25, they had no clue. They had they had to go to Wikipedia and find out who Margaret Mead was. But it did turn out that demographic knew exactly who she was and was interested. Oh yeah, you're back.
I'm trying to figure out how to ask a question that's.
I'm scared.
It's interesting. I come from the literary side, and actually write a lot of historical figures, and I think a lot about this. And I guess my question, or the commentary I'm thinking of, is we're talking about this in a very, a lot of the questions, and because this is a social science environment, we're sort of avoiding the literary questions in a certain way. There's no one thinking, we're taking your word for it when you say that, well, this is how the imagination works, or this is how a novel works, or this is how authority functions. But I think that those ideas, just as anthropology and political science have advanced, and the conversation is quite complex, in the literary side, those are also incredibly complex questions. And I understand that the way you wrote this book is one particular way, but I just think I at least have to say, from the literary side, that those are complicated, formal, and there's a million aesthetic choices made when you decide where those tracks meet, how authority in a book is going to work, what the role of the author's, sort of patina is, where rupture occurs, where closure is made or not made. And like you said, well, you're not into speechifying or argumentation, and yet in the contemporary literary scene, certainly argumentation as a literary modality is quite interesting. And people are not afraid of putting forward works that argue within the context of the work itself. Argue with history, let history argue itself, don't put forth one sort of unified authorial voice. I mean, that these are sort of the kinds of things that are out there. So I don't really have a question, and I'm but I hear that you've made certain kinds of choices with this historical book, and maybe, but I don't know enough about you as a writer to know, did you struggle with, I guess, formal issues of authority within constructing the novel itself?
That's a really hard question. I so often feel, this is really going to be maybe a disappointing answer, but for me, it is not an intellectual process when I'm writing that first draft. I often say I feel like I'm a worm on the ground, and I am just feeling my way, and I'm just trying to take the next step that feels the most right of all the steps. And I can't articulate it to myself like that. I just know that when I make choices, like with the first chapter, when it was from Nell's perspective, and it was, maybe first person, then third person, and each time I was just trying to just get to what feels right, and that's why you're a great writer. I don't know, and afterwards, kind of a year afterwards, I can look at it and think about it more theoretically and with more of an intellectual gaze. But when I'm making those choices, they don't feel like choices so often. They don't. If I labeled them like that, I think I would not write. It would stop me in some way. But I know that everybody writes in completely different ways, and so I'm sorry, I don't really know how to answer that any better than that.
So I think we'll wrap it up there. We started with a notion that I love of invested observers, writers and anthropologists, and we end with the worm crawling along the ground, which I think is where a lot of us feel we spend a lot of our time. But please join me in worming your way to the buffet and.